It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff. And Peter, just before I hit record this morning, we were talking about the International Space Station because I've been watching the International Space Station fly overhead early in the pre-dawn hours a few times this week. It is maybe the size of a small house.
Right.
Not a terribly huge thing. Mm-hmm. It's 250 miles up in orbit.
Right, which is kind of hard to imagine, but it's way up there.
Yeah, think about from here to Philadelphia away.
Right.
And it's the size of a house, but it reflects so much sunlight that it's the third brightest object in the night sky after the moon and Venus, which is very prominent this time of year, the morning star. And it just puts things into perspective for me that there we are up in space. 6 men are flying around the planet at almost 5 miles per second.
Wow. And it kind of feels that way when you look at it, right? It's just racing. Like it's unbelievable to see that.
It has it looks like a star. It's not like it doesn't look like an airplane because there are no blinking lights on it. It looks like a star with a place to be in a hurry.
Exactly.
You know, it's moving across the sky. And you can track the International Space Station. The NASA website will send you email advisories about when it's going to be in your part of the country, so you can look up and see it at night, or as I've been doing before the sun comes up. It's amazing. But it reminds me of scale.
Right.
And people I know who've been listening to the show a lot have been struck by the idea of scale. That, like, for instance, that the United States may be too big.
Right. Yeah, I love posing that question to a lot of our guests to see how they react. And it's pretty consistent, which is a fun reaction to get. It's like, wow. Thanks for bringing that up.
Many of the guests have noted that. Zephyr Teachout a few weeks ago noted that. And I'm just curious, where did that idea come from? And can you articulate it a little bit for folks?
Well, I guess it first really came from the other thing I talk about a lot, which is bioregions. You know, we had Spencer Beebe on the show before, and he really introduced me to that idea, and it made so much sense. And then I started to get further and further into history, and pretty much everything I can trace in terms of conflict comes to overpopulation or resource depletion or some sort of, bumping up against somebody else. And so, and then the difficulty, on the other hand, of governing large groups of people. As the groups get larger, it seems that things start to fray, at least around the edges or maybe in the center. I don't know, one or the other. And so everything sort of points to scale as being an ongoing issue. And then you look at the country, frankly, and you think it's pretty darn big. And one of the biggest ones there is. I mean, obviously, Russia's bigger and some others, but we may be too big for our britches.
And what happens there, I think, too, is when you get to be too big, you can't. Everything has to be sort of issued institutionally. Like if you're going to govern, you can't be worried about this one person or that one person because you've got the whole in mind. And a lot of people on the fringes get left behind because of that.
Right. And there are different kinds of fringes, of course. Certainly economic fringes are the most obvious in a lot of ways. But cultural fringes, again, how could we possibly think that someone in Alabama, someone in Oregon, and someone in Maine have the same interests and needs and issues that they want to deal with? I mean, and that's not to say any of them are wrong or right. It's just they're very, very different.
Yeah, it's interesting, and they're bound together by this notion of being American. Those disparate regions, when what they have much more in common than that sort of artificial construct has to do with surviving the cold New England winters, which doesn't mean a lot to people, perhaps in Alabama.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing I've started to realize is that when we were in smaller groups, we were literally clans. We would wander around hunting and gathering with family members and extended family members. And as we were more successful, we'd become tribes. And then as we kind of settled down in a place that had a lot of resources, we might become a small little city or something. And as we grew, we needed something to keep the kinship alive. Because once it wasn't a family, then you had sort of a mythology around something to collectively believe in. And then you have religions, and then you have flags. And, you really see that it goes from the very real to the very abstract. And it's hard to keep an abstract family intact.
It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff. It's Radio Woodstock 100.1. And next, we're going to be joined in the studio for the whole show today by Rich Blundell. He's going to blow your mind. It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff, and we are joined in the studio this time by Rich Blundell.
Hello, Rich.
Hello. Oh, my God. I'm listening to this show. I feel like I'm actually listening to it.
But you're here.
This is awesome. Oh, my God.
Exactly.
Can I just say thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the show, because I know, because I've been listening to the show now, and I can hear the caliber and the interestingness of the people you've had. You could have had any one of those big history bigwigs on this show, and you're allowing
we
me to
went with you.
I just said thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have waited until after this is over.
Right.
Maybe I'm going to be like cursing you for ruining my career,
No,
or for allowing me to ruin my career.
Right, exactly. If anyone's going to do it, you are. So, no. Well, obviously we've met before, and since then I've been really enamored with big history, both as an idea and the actual reading of it and learning more about it. And maybe you can start by explaining a little bit to the listener what big history really is.
I can try. I mean, I dread this question because it means so much to me. So,
right.
And it's complex. But
yeah.
Basically, big history is an attempt to understand human history in the context of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to really understand it, in order to get a really, holistic understanding of humans, you got to know something about the universe too. You have to understand the preconditions to humans.
Right.
And those preconditions extend all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So that's what big history attempts to do. It attempts to understand all of that stuff that happened before us that makes us us.
Right.
And so that requires science. In the beginning of the story, there's a lot of science, physics, astronomy, chemistry, biology, geology. All those ologies are sort of bunched up at the beginning of the story, but then you slowly shift into the human part, the social sciences, the economics, the art. So in order to really get a holistic view of this whole picture that we're a part of, that's what big history is attempting to do. And what I really love about big history, and what also kind of drives me crazy about it, is that its commitment to science or evidence-based knowledge, basically.
Right.
And so that in there is a critical piece of it. Is a really critical piece. Now, there's the field of big history, which is the academic discipline that has just emerged to try to make sense of it all. Mm-hmm. And then there's the subject of big history, which is the story itself, the story of the universe.
And one of the things I think that is really important to note is just what you said, which is it is interdisciplinary. It breaks down silos. And I think the last 500 years in particular of reductionism has created silos and people not talking to each other about the very disciplines they're so interested in and focused on. And that has created siloed information, and that's where power lives, is in trying to keep people from talking to each other. So big history breaks down all these walls and gives us a picture I don't think we've really ever had before.
Yeah, it requires that. That's a requisite of understanding big history, is to break through those boundaries. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I have a real affection for the disciplines and reductionism too.
Right.
But the thing about, and my family will get a chuckle out of this, but the thing about reductionism is you're taking things apart to understand them.
Right.
But then you got to put them back together again. And that sometimes is the part that we leave out with science, is putting stuff back together again.
And it's hard because you're talking about having some understanding of all those disciplines, right? So I don't know how you keep all that in your head.
I don't. That's why I have cheat sheets here, and and the numbers, and the dates, and a lot of times the names. I can't keep track of that stuff. But I think it's really most important to know that stuff only insofar as it contributes to the way that understanding the story can transform us.
Right.
In other words, just knowing the dates and things like that doesn't matter.
Right.
But the sequence of those dates and the scales of time between those dates,
Right.
that's what's really important, I think, about it.
Exactly. And we actually, Jimmy and I started the show today talking about scale, and that he saw the International Space Station this morning, and just what that does to your mind. And so the idea, he saw it in space. He wasn't.
I wasn't there.
Right,
But
exactly.
You mean you looked through a telescope and saw it, or binoculars?
No, you
Oh,
can
by
see it
naked
with
eye.
Yeah, with your naked
So
eye.
you were up that early?
Yeah, I was. Yeah,
Right.
and you can see it in the evenings too. And they, depending on where it crosses the planet, the NASA has a website, and they'll tell you where in your area you can see it. And as we mentioned, it's 250 miles up in space, maybe the size of this building. Yet it's the third largest, brightest object in the night sky after the moon and Venus. And those guys, the 6 people on the space station right now, International Space Station, are looking down on the entire planet. So they're not really focused on that little sliver of sound bite that has the internet in uproar right now.
Right, exactly. They're
cool
seeing
that-
the whole thing.
It's cool that you're looking up at it thinking it's this crazy, awesome technical machine, but they're looking down at this one, at where this is where the complexity is. Man.
Right.
This is where the action is down here.
Exactly. And so I want to also let the listener know you're on for the whole show, which is something we haven't done before, because we have, 14 billion years to cover? Something like that.
Yeah.
So we figured we'd take the whole hour. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the most logical and rational place to start the story of the universe is actually in mystery, because we don't know. You ask any physicist, they don't know what's all the way back there before the Big Bang.
Right.
We can get it down to 10 to the negative 43 seconds, which is a decimal point with 43 zeros, 1 seconds. But before that, mystery. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that mystery, because we can talk, for hours about what we know.
Right.
But what we don't know is right there at the beginning. And
Right.
here's the funny thing about that mystery. We don't know what it is. So it's like it could be present here. So in other words, if
Exactly.
instead of starting with the Big Bang, like here's what we know, you start with that mystery. It's the mystery that's expanding.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
I love that. No, and someone once said that that's where science and religion meet. It's like, just give us one free miracle, and then we can explain everything
Okay.
else.
Yeah, well, I can buy that, but I also not sure I'd call it religion, because religion does have a place in this story.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
13.8
absolutely.
billion years later.
Yep.
But yeah, so that's where I would start it with this. How long do you want to spend on this? Because you're right, it's 13.8 billion years. How long do we?
A little less than that.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want me to? Let's see how far I get then.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, and I'm a little different. Like if you study the big history narrative as it's out there,
Mm-hmm.
what I try to do it a little bit differently. In other words, I try to focus more on the relationships as opposed to the entities that they talk about. Maybe that'll become clear as I go along here. But essentially, we've got mystery.
Right.
Suddenly, for some mysterious reason, that mystery begins to expand really fast, really hot, really dense. You can't even imagine what this environment is like. If you were to get plopped back into, 200,000 years after the Big Bang and took a picture with your iPhone, it would be unrecognizable. And it's the whole universe. It's not like you have somewhere else to go back to show your friends. That's it, man. The entire universe is a dense, hot, white plasma of unimaginable energy. In fact, it's so energetic that these little things that we call particles can't even live there. They can't even function. They can't maintain their own structure because there's so much energy. The minute they come into existence, they go back out. So that's what the early universe looks like, about before 380,000 years. And the other thing that happens, and this is really interesting, is that fundamental forces emerge during that time. So there's 4 of them that we pretty much identify: gravity, the strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, and electromagnetism. Those 4 forces are the definers of the relationships. See, so it's really important to start thinking now about relationships, because as this thing cools, as this universe expands and cools, it finally gets to a point at 380,000 years ago that it cools enough so that matter can actually exist.
I'm going to correct you. 380,000 years after the Big Bang.
Okay, yeah. What did I say?
Yeah, you said 380,000 years ago.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Which, by the way, is just like not even a blink in cosmic time.
Right.
But at that time, things cool down enough so that these material entities, these particles, can exist. and they still are in relationship. You got to remember that gravity is still in effect. All these other forces are still in effect. But as it and then by the way, this moment we can actually see this. If we look back in time to 380,000 years after the Big Bang, we can actually see this wall of when this event happened and the universe went through this phase transition. And it shows up like a sphere, like the inside surface of a sphere that's covered with slight temperature and density differentials. Anyway, it's called the cosmic background radiation. So after that threshold is crossed, we've got a dark universe. Space is dark and cold, kind of like the space that you could see this morning when you're looking at. That's the space that emerged at that 380,000 year mark. So, but all that material, all that residual hydrogen and helium that was formed in the beginning of the universe is still out there. It's floating around, and it's still subject to those rules, those forces, and those forces start to pull that hydrogen back together into these aggregates of hydrogen. When those hydrogen aggregates get big enough and the gravity is strong enough, it ignites a nuclear furnace, and bang, that's the emergence of stars. So stars suddenly appear in the universe. Now, if you went back to this world, this universe with your iPhone and took a picture, you'd think, this is the world. It's dark, there are stars, but no galaxies, no Earth, no humans, no life, nothing, none of this complexity that we see around us. But it's just you'd think that was the world. That was the universe at that time. So here's what's cool, though. Those forces that were there at the beginning of the universe, well, we still have them, and they're still acting. Now they're acting on stars. Okay, so the stars tend to congregate just like the atoms of hydrogen did into what we can now recognize as galaxies and globular clusters. So this new structure emerges in the universe. That emergent moment, that's like it happens again and again and again all the time. We're in this constant state of new things emerging, like right now. Anyway.
Right. And they're emerging because of the relationships between them and the temperature differentials that cause them, right?
Well, it depends on
gravitation.
It depends on what entity we're talking about. If we're talking about if we're talking about the stars, it's about gravity at first, and then nuclear. The nuclear force gets involved, and when that kicks in and starts ripping the nucleus apart, that's when nuclear fusion begins. That's when bigger and bigger elements get created as well. Hydrogen, helium, calcium, oxygen, all the things that we live by today. And this is the origin of that idea that we are made of star stuff, is that this is going on inside the middle of stars, but it's a cosmic process. And we can all sort of agree that this is a cosmic process. Well, that cosmic process is still going on. In fact, it's going on in this room. It's not just going on in the stars. It's that process of novelty popping out of relationships in new ways. That's like the story of the universe. And this is emergence. And I think, somehow we're overlooking this. It reminds me of that story. There's two young fish swimming along, older fish going the other direction. Says, "Hey, how's the water today, boys?" And they, they smile at them politely. They keep swimming along. 10 minutes later, like, what the hell is water?
Right.
It's like that. I mean, it's really like that. We're like immersed in this all the time, and we forget. It's so obvious that we actually have to stop and take note of it.
Right.
So I don't know where we are in the evolution of the universe here, but
we've got
stars
galaxies
and universes,
stars and galaxies, galactic systems. So here's the other cool thing: is those stars. The ancients thought that they were just permanent. Like this was the one permanent thing in the universe was stars. Well, it turns out they're not. They actually have a life cycle. And I can use the phrase life cycle, and everybody knows what I mean. But are they alive? But they are born. They do have a life, and then they do die.
Right.
And by the way, that's an emergent thing. That entities can have a life cycle. Even that is an emergent thing. Okay. So some of those stars, depending on what their mass is to begin with and how big they are, they either burn through their hydrogen really quickly and go supernova, at which point they create all the rest of the heavy elements, because stars can only go up to about iron. But in order to get the rest of the stuff, the really heavy elements, we need something like a supernova explosion. And in that explosion, there's this massive percussion wave, and it goes out and it creates all the heavier elements, and it also disperses all these elements, these raw materials for the rest of the universe, out into space. And
I have a feeling a planet is coming.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. About, I think it's like almost 5 billion years ago, there was a supernova, it's believed, in this area, and our solar system is basically the rubble. It's formed from the rubble of that. And so what you get is the same process that happened at the beginning of the universe, and in the formation of stars, and in the formation of galaxies, is now happening with the formation of a solar system. So you have this central star that forms, hydrogen comes together, helium starts to ignite, sends out this energy, and there's this ring of debris, and toward the middle of the debris is all the rocky and metallic planets, and further out are the gassy planets. So you get this differentiation happening, which is really important to understand that this is it, because that process of differentiation of a solar system is critical. That happens all the time. When we talk about economic systems later on and how they evolved through differentiation and specialization and division of labor and all that stuff, same cosmic process.
That is a critically important piece that I really do hope we get to zero in on, is the fractal nature, I guess.
That's one way to think of fractals. I mean, you can think of fractals as a mathematician does, or you can think about fractals as a lived experience.
Right.
A fractal as a lived experience is being able to understand that this stuff happens across all scales, and you can't get outside of it. You're in it. You're part of it. You're an intimate part of it. So we've got solar systems now. We've got this incredibly rare planet, this like rocky planet that's so improbable. I even have a hard time believing that it's not. The fact that it's so improbable that we have this planet is something we overlook all the time.
Right. I'm going to say quickly that this is What's Next. I'm Peter Buffett, and we're talking to Rich Blundell. And now we're on the planet Earth.
All right, great segue.
Yes.
What's a planet?
Right. Well, I was actually interested to learn that Jupiter was almost a star, right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was some information somewhere where it was like a failed star.
Okay. Well, that happens. That definitely.
Right. Yeah.
So there's diversity in terms of stars too. Like some are fast and burn really fast. Some are slow. Like some are medium, like ours, 10 billion year lifespan.
Right.
Luckily for us, we've got another 5 billion years left. So anyway, we've got this Earth now, which is essentially a stage, and it's getting rained down on it from all those supernova generations prior. What's raining down are all the raw materials for the stuff that we are, the stuff that we live in right now.
Right.
And you get water, by the way, which is an emergent property. When you get hydrogen and oxygen coming together and getting kinky, you get water out of that. Okay, so that's everywhere. And you've got all these dissolved organic and non-organic. And here's the fun. When I was growing up, I thought, life, it'll never be explained. Like, how can you explain the difference between something that's alive and something that isn't? Well, we have possible scenarios for that. Not just possible, but plausible. Okay, so you can, if you really study on your own time, the genesis of life, it makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, I can understand how that can happen. Once you really understand the details enough, you can think it's possible. So there's a connection between the living and the non-living there that you can. There's a bridge there that you can go across.
Right.
Even though we don't know exactly what it is, there's some really plausible theories.
Right, but there is a little mystery there, which, again, we started with a mystery. Now we're at another mystery.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
But, again, if you were to take, if you could somehow magically travel to that early Earth, by the way, this is after a period of intense bombardment with asteroids and volcanic activity everywhere. It was inhospitable. So the point is, life didn't just happen. There was a period when this planet was utterly hell. You couldn't. Life could not exist on this planet.
Right.
That's really important when we think later about something like climate change. Look, there's no guarantee that it's going to be this pleasant here. It has been this. It has been this way in the past, and it can go back. It is possible that this planet can become non-inhabitable to humans, and we have to take that seriously because it's happened before. And once you sort of confront that reality, it becomes more of a possibility. It breaks you out of this dream that we're in that it could never happen.
Right.
And it can, and we could do it.
Right.
And we might. Okay, but anyway, the point is we've got life now on the planet. It's early life. It's simple. It's the atmosphere. It doesn't have any, it's not an oxygen-rich. It's a reducing atmosphere.
Right, which is an interesting thing to learn, is that the atmosphere was not at all oxygen-based. It was really like ammonia. What was it? Sulfur?
Well, it was reducing. It was So it was highly toxic to life today.
Right.
But that shifted when through other process of emergences and all kinds of other special relationships that were going on. You get these multicellular organisms and these organisms that can create oxygen and put it into the atmosphere. And there's evidence for all of this. And if you have the time, you always just look at the rocks. You look at banded iron formations. This story is recorded for us.
Right.
So, but over time, things get more and more complex through more and more emergences, and as they do, more and more new relationships pop up, and some of those relationships are dead ends, and some of them catch on, and the system shifts because of it.
Right.
So sometimes an emergence happens where the system in which it is, the system in which it takes place, it changes the system.
Right.
Which is really
also
important.
an important, very important point when you think about where we are today.
Right. Yeah. So systems can shift, and they can shift because of these momentary magical things that happen called emergences. And they happen across all scales. And then we've got, evolution kicks in, Darwinian evolution, which may have kicked in earlier. We don't really know. There's this idea called universal Darwinism, but we don't need to go to that. The point is we've got this process for increasing diversity, increasing the capacity for new relationships on the planet through living forms.
Some people call it novelty, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And eventually, there's by sheer accident or some sort of force in the universe, creative force, this organism emerges that has a specific sort of neural circuitry up in its head. It's not about size. It's about the complexity and the density and the structure of the neural circuitry. And a new emergence happens. This sort of this consciousness, that can emerge from that particular relationship between neurons in a biological brain happens. Okay, and it shifts. That's one of those ones that shifts the system. It's a really important emergence. And you know the story from here. I mean, that's the part. This is where it gets blurry for me too.
Right.
After humans emerge and the agrarian revolution and the acceleration happens and the industrial revolution, technology and all that stuff. It goes fast, but but the point is somehow we've managed to keep these two stories separate somehow.
Right.
Scientists do that stuff. Historians do that stuff.
Right.
No,
right.
That won't work anymore.
Exactly. And I think that's the critical piece of this, obviously, which we talked about in the beginning, is breaking down those walls between the two and going, okay, wait a minute, this is all related.
Yeah. And also letting the data guide us into that. It's like the data is saying, look, if you really want to understand this process, you can't just specialize in one tiny little thing. You can, and that will be productive and that will be valuable knowledge. But if you really want to take hold of it, if you really want to maximize your understanding, you got to go bigger. You got to start thinking out. Context matters.
Right.
And context doesn't necessarily match your particular discipline.
Exactly. And so do we want to then start at about 200,000 years ago when we showed up, or is there more to say before we get there?
Well, there's always more to say.
I mean, there's a lot more to say.
There's always more to say.
There's that meteor, for instance. That.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, how much time do we have though to really talk about?
Exactly.
About the story itself, because it's a rich story. We can talk about it forever.
Right, and to remember that the show we're on is called What's Next, and my greatest feeling is that you can't know where you're going unless you know where you come from, right? So, and generally, although we're talking about the planet in the bigger sense, we're talking about us as the only species that's really had its hands on all the controls that could bring ourselves down, and some things certainly down with us. But really, I don't think there's another species that says, if we make some wrong decisions, we're not going to be here anymore.
Well, other species have done it. I mean, when the atmosphere changed from reducing to oxygen, I mean, that was caused by living organisms that just wiped themselves out.
Right, exactly.
Luckily for us.
But. Yeah, but how much consciousness around the systems they were, right?
Well, I don't know.
Right. That's true. Which I'm going to say one thing that's always been on my mind in terms of understanding ourselves and history in general and prehistory, because I also always want to remind people that when we talk about history, we're talking about 10,000 years or so of what most people, because people talking about human history, recorded history, that's a very, very small slice of time. And I think people think it's all time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another thing that's really great about big history is that it presents an opportunity to examine that,
Right.
and to question that and to see it, to be aware of the scale of change that we have that we have caused so rapidly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty reckless, if you ask me.
It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff. It's Radio Woodstock 100.1. More with Rich Blundell in just a moment. It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff, and time for another episode of Cello Dog and Mr. B, and this one has a lot to do with what we're talking about this week.
Hey, Cello Dog,
Hey, Mr. B.
do you think it's possible for everyone to feel joyful and included?
Oh, yeah, Mr. B. In fact, I'm sure that this has been the case for most of your human existence, and it will be again. Humans haven't been around for very long. Only about 200,000 years. Trees, that tree over there, about 350 million years. The bird in the tree? I'd say about 150 million years of birds. The bee buzzing around your head? About 90 million. I would give you humans at least another few million years before you really figure yourselves out.
Thanks, Cello Dog. That makes me feel more hopeful.
It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff, and we're joined again by Rich Blundell.
I'd like to now kind of kick us forward to about 200,000 years ago so we can talk about us as humans. But there's one question that always nags me, and that is, in general, we're talking about 500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery, and maybe about 150 years of really deep ologies, in terms of maybe 200 years. But still today, there's something uncovered and people go, oh my God, that reset our whole thinking around X or around Y. So I always wonder, is there going to be, somebody somewhere that digs something up and goes, oops, this happened way differently than we thought it did?
Probably not that big. I mean,
Okay.
It's a
Good, actually.
Well, I mean, it's all provisional. It's the story itself is provisional, but we have a system here for ferreting out wrong information.
Right.
Every graduate student out there is committed to proving something wrong.
Right.
And stuff. This is the philosophy of science, and this is how it's supposed to work when it works. Ideally. But I don't know. But then again, we're discovering stuff. I do think that we are in the midst of a paradigm shift. I know that sounds, kind of cliche, but I do think that we are coming to new understandings of the stuff we already know. So I'm not sure that like a discovery is going to come along and says and shift everything. But I think new interpretations of the stuff we already know has the capacity to really put us into a new orbit.
Right. I love that. And that is why we're here, and it's why you're here. So interpret away.
And that actually happens a lot. Cholesterol from eggs was bad for 25 years, and suddenly it's not anymore.
Yeah.
They re-examine the same evidence with different, and there was a paradigm shift in that.
Is that a paradigm shift? I mean, I think Kuhn, who wrote the Structure of Science, he might disagree with you.
Okay,
but it is. I'm thinking more along the lines of who are we in the universe? that's what I mean by.
Oh, indeed. And
Yeah.
I was just using that as a common daily example of how something can be something, and then it's not anymore. It's
Yeah.
something
Well, that's
different.
Which
normal.
happens
Though.
a lot.
That's
Yeah.
what's to be expected in a story that we're writing as we learn.
Yeah.
That's
Right. Yeah.
that's
Good. Yeah.
and that's the other thing that makes you feel like you're actually at the cutting. We are actually on the cutting edge of these new understandings. Like there is no future that we're really working into. We're creating the reality of the future as we go along here. So it makes sense that it's provisional. You know,
Right,
it
right.
makes sense that we're getting better and better. But you know what? We'll probably never finish this task. And this gets into some real deep philosophy about the nature of knowledge. You know,
Right,
in other words,
right.
if you really start thinking about emergence and you think about ideas as emergent properties of the universe, a new idea extends the universe. Yeah, It's not just expanding physically, but a new idea that emerges is part of the universe too. So that's where we are, man. Like we're at that advancing edge of the universe through our knowledge as well. I think it's hard to grasp, but
Right.
that's the kind of interpretation that can shift everything.
And what's so interesting is knowledge expands that and imagination expands
Absolutely,
that, right?
yeah.
And that is limitless to some extent.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where the edge of that is, but the idea that we are imbued with imagination, where, again, I'm not sure other species are. I think they probably are in some ways, but we have a certain
We do.
capacity that is way beyond all the others. And so
Well,
let's go back and start
Well,
there.
this is why I sort of mentioned that if you were to go back to the early universe and take an iPhone photo, if you were to go back to the early Earth, go back to the Jurassic and look around, and you would think that was the world, but
Right.
we live in a radically different world than that. Tomorrow is going to be just as radically different,
Right.
And that means radically different. And therein, and you know what? It all goes all the way back to that mystery. That radical
Right.
change somehow connected to that mystery
Right.
at the beginning. It's still with us.
And therein lies what's next, because the current culture, I think, always wants things to appear somewhat static so it can survive, so it can stay intact in some way. Because if every moment is essentially a revolutionary or evolutionary moment, that's scary to a lot of people because they need to count on something.
But that can change too.
Right.
That idea that
yes,
that idea that we all want it to be static, or that we're afraid of that change, that can change.
Right. Right.
And that's part of the practice here, I think, is getting comfortable with that level of radical change and actually finding some joy in it, some sort of satisfaction in participating in that radical creativity of the universe.
Right. That is a tremendous line, to find joy in participating in the radical creativity of the universe.
As opposed to going to the old standby fear that this is going to take everything that I care about or love away. It's
Exactly.
not, actually.
Exactly. So maybe we could, for a minute, focus on that. So we've been around about 200,000 years, right? If we could recognize ourselves as the person that came into work with you today or something 200,000 years ago. And yet we weren't writing until about 35,000 years ago, or speaking, I should say, until about 35,000 years ago, writing about 5,000 years ago, right? Is that,
Yep.
am I on track so far?
Yep.
So for over 150,000 years, as far as we know, we were not actually speaking. Is that
No,
true?
but we were communicating.
Right.
And this is what I think is really cool. Like, maybe we have been accountants for 10,000 years, but we've been artists for like 35 or 40,000. We were artists long before we were accountants.
Right. Hallelujah.
Yet the human condition, though, has people so focused on what's here and now. They don't look beyond the borders, right? Like I heard a description of a light year recently.
Yeah.
And a light year, in terms of distance, is if you stretch out a mile, a light year is an inch of that mile.
Okay.
Right? So people aren't thinking for the mile, they're thinking for the inch. They're thinking that, the world was different, and it could be different, but not beyond my borders, not beyond my horizon.
Yeah, but engaging with the cosmic narrative has this way of becoming relevant to this moment. You don't have to think in terms of light years. It's today, man. It's like now. These physics, these phenomena, these forces, these processes, we're immersed in them now. This stuff is now. And we can draw on the wisdom of light years ago today. You know, this is what it means to like notice the water you're swimming in. We're surrounded by all this creativity. It's showing. The signposts are everywhere about our connection to this universe. That's not theoretical. That's practical. You know, it matters to today. Knowing how we got into these situations is one thing. You know, that's the explanatory power of the story. But then there's a phenomenological or a lived experience power of the story that we can all experience today, right now. You know. It's a shift, though. It's a real paradigm shift it's a cognitive shift, which is what my research is all about, that we have to go through in order to actually become aware of that.
Right.
Does that make any sense?
Well, it does, but it's a challenge for people who are worried about the electric bill.
Right.
That's true. Okay, but assessing all these systems with that old mindset, it doesn't change the systems. Do you see what I mean? So it's like we can talk about the suffering that we're all experiencing, but that suffering has emerged, you know, as part of that other system. You know, it's a system that we've inherited. We have to be thinking about a world where that suffering doesn't. We do need to deconstruct the reasons and the precursors to these problems, but we also, in the process, need to be creating a world where those problems, you know, don't exist.
Right.
We'll have new problems to face in the future, but you know,
and is some of it through our education process, the difference between learning about things and filling our heads up with information so we can better behave and act and make a living for ourselves in today's world, as opposed to putting the emphasis on felt experience, on knowing things because you live them and feel them and understand them, if that makes sense.
I feel like trying to do this through the educational system is critical, but it's also really hard.
Right.
Really hard. I mean, it's a hardened system. It goes through change, you know, reluctantly all the time. I'm thinking culture is more of this expedient way to do these kinds of shifts. You know, It has to be part of the culture, and not count on the educational system to create the culture, but kind of let the culture help create the educational system. Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's why, like in my dissertation, I've tried to take this creative practice approach, which tries to bring these ideas into culture directly, you know, straight to the jugular of the problem.
Right.
I think.
Could you explain how you do that, or would like to do that, or would like to see culture absorb some of this information in a different way? Sorry, that's a tough one.
Well, I think artists play the leading role here, you know, and I think especially artists who know the science. Whoa, talk about powerful.
Right.
I think if we can get, you know, scientifically inspired scientists and artistically inspired scientists to start creating programs, media, curricula, that kind of stuff that taps into this story in this new interpretive way that privileges relations over matter. Yeah. You know, I think we'll be on the right track.
Right.
But it's risky, you know, like it's just risky. I just came through this academic grinder, and it's like, you know, it was tough. It was tough to say the things that I really felt needed to be said in that academic environment. And I understand why that is. I mean, I understand the philosophy of science. I understand why they want to protect the sanctity of empirical knowledge and all that.
Right.
But, you know, I think we need to assess the damage that our educational system is, the injury that we're suffering now because of our educational system, and then let it change. And
again, to me, the kind of the grip, not even kind of, the grip that culture has on our various systems like education and economic and social, and even the way religion has the grip on people because of the fear. I mean, we've sort of grown our systems around fear, and a lot of people will say, "Oh, we've always been this way. We've always been at battle, or we've always had something like slavery, or there's always been this us against them and othering." And I say no, and part of that is the limited knowledge I have of the history of this hemisphere before the Europeans came. And not that it was all unicorns and rainbows, but there was a different way of living and relating to each other. And that's kind of the best history I know that's both recent and prehistory at the same time.
I'm not sure we should endeavor to go back. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to go back.
I agree.
But we can draw on that knowledge and bring it forward because it's needed.
Right, exactly.
And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's a good idea.
Right.
And you mentioned religion. I just want to say this one thing about religion because that comes up a lot. I'm a scientist first and foremost, really. Maybe an artist, hopefully, trying to be anyway. But I'm a scientist. And you know what? I love religion. I just love it. In terms of like how it emerged in the universe and what it sought to do, and it's this expression of this human ingenuity and creativity and wanting to belong to something bigger. All of those things are, why would you want the dogma and all that stuff could go? But the point is, in its purest form, religion is part of this story too.
Absolutely. And
we're still working it out. I mean.
No, really, it's only any of those systems, frankly, as control mechanisms where the issue comes in.
Absolutely.
But as a invention, as a creative act, essentially, many things are to be celebrated, really. And I had talked before you came in about the fact that for many thousands of years, you can probably tell me how many, we were in clans. We were in family and extended family units. And it was easy to find meaning in that because you kind of knew who you were hanging around with. When it gets to tribal and larger, you have to start to come up with these kind of larger ideas of belonging. And then when you suddenly settle down and you become cities and states, and then I think monotheism sort of came out of that. It's like we need a bigger father to believe in, something larger, which is, again, not to say it's bad. It's just that it's needed. You talk about it a lot. We are meaning-making machines. We constantly have to have that as our guiding force to some extent.
And that meaning-making emerged. It emerged from those same processes that happened at the beginning of the universe, that happened in the formation of galaxies. It's the same process of emergence, just in the realm of ideas.
Right.
And I don't know. I think that let's keep going with it. Let's just keep pushing ahead with more and more ideas on how to be in this universe.
Right.
And those the ones you were mentioning, they worked at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, 35,000 years ago, again, to get to the spoken word, imagine the technology behind these small mouth noises we're making, right? And that we agree on the meaning, which allows them to spread. It's no different essentially than the printing press or the internet. It is a technology that we're using right now talking to each other.
Well, and an extension of that technology is going into this microphone, through that box over there, out through an antenna to the whole region here, which is like, by the way, thank you for that.
That's why we call it the magic of radio.
Every time I come here, though, I look forward to listening to this station, man. This is that's such a good vibe. It really it comes through the waves, man.
Right.
So I don't know.
What occurs to me though is that mystery before, right? We go to however many zeros for 0.0000041. We know we can track the beginning of the Big Bang to that moment.
Yeah.
But we don't know what's it, and which to me points up the limitation of our thinking, right? We can't imagine nothingness before somethingness. Like there had to be something before something, right?
I just came from a Buddhist, they shouldn't call it a retreat. There was not a lot of retreating going on there, but I came from this Buddhist thing, and we were getting into the void and whether or not, it seems like they have a pretty good handle on what that nothing is. So,
but people do because people want to fill that vacuum with something. They want to fill it with a creation myth of one sort or another that works for a particular belief system for them.
Right.
Because we don't like the mystery.
Right. But I would argue that let's look around at the problems we face, maybe we should start designing our origin myths around some of the problems. In other words, let's look at the problems that we're facing, in particular the Anthropocene, which is part of my research. We can talk about that if you want. But looking at the problems we face and reflect on them, the solutions that we want to create in our narratives.
Right.
It's What's Next with Peter Buffett. I'm Jimmy Buff, and we're in the studio with Rich Blundell. And, Rich, you have sort of an experiment talking about radio and music. You have sort of a way to illustrate emergence for us?
A way to feel it. A way to
even better
lived experience of emergence. And, this one, I've never said this before. I've never tried this before, so it's an experiment. But I figured it'd be good for radio because it's very audio-oriented. Essentially, this is a story of emergence, and it's a very special emergence because we actually captured it on tape, which is a really rare thing, to capture a moment of emergence. And this is a huge moment of emergence. You have to think about a universe before Southern rock. You have to think about the universe before Lynyrd Skynyrd, before Marshall Tucker, before the Allman Brothers. It didn't exist in the universe. But on this one November day, I think it was 1968, in a little studio down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And you've got to think about the context of this. This is the Deep South, 1968. There's all kinds of racial tensions. Right. The hippie thing is just starting to get up. Duane Allman is down in Alabama trying to get a job as a session guitarist. He's at Muscle Shoals. Wexler, the guy who runs it, is up in New York, can't be around. Wilson Pickett shows up at the studio to record something. Rick Hall, the owner of the studio, has to take over because Wexler's gone. So this is the context. So this is the backdrop. The session musicians, who are really great, they go out to lunch, and they feel uncomfortable going out there with a colored guy, so they don't want to be out there, in the Deep South. They talk about getting these looks and feeling this energy. Duane Allman, who's this like hippie, long hair, doing him especially, they don't want to be seen with him. So Wilson Pickett and Duane Allman hang out back at the studio while these guys go to lunch. They get the idea to record "Hey Jude," which is a Beatles song, Paul McCartney, a pop song. They get the idea to record that. Okay, so everybody's against it pretty much, but they try it anyway. So all these contextualizing issues are out there. They come back to the studio after lunch. They start the song, and it's this classic Wilson Pickett. It starts out as this classic,
right? Yeah.
What'd you call it? Soul,
R&B.
Yeah, kind of bluesy.
Yeah.
All stuff that's in the universe already. We've already got the blues. We've already got jazz. We've already got Wilson Pickett. So as the song goes on, though, at about 2 minutes and 58 seconds, something happens. Right here. That is the moment of the emergence of Southern rock in the universe on that November day, 1968.
That's awesome.
That's
great.
Amazing.
That's how it works, too, man. And it's everywhere.
Right,
That's
it. And you can't take that apart. It happened in combination.
And here's the really cool thing. It depended on all of those contexts, the diversity of those. If it was just, we're a bunch of dudes sitting around jamming, that does happen. But it was that particular diversity of contexts that created that moment. And ever since, the world has been changed.
Including social context and culture, right? Because they didn't go out to lunch. They stayed back. They talked. Yeah, I mean, it's
exactly.
Yeah.
But that process of emergence, that happens at the beginning of the universe. That happened at the beginning of the planet. That happened at the beginning of life. It happens in this room. It happens in your... when ideas come together like that, that's emergence. Our thoughts are emergent. That's nuts. And nobody's really talking about that yet. But the big history story makes that like abundantly clear.
What's Next with Peter Buffett? I'm Jimmy Buff, and our thanks again to Rich Blundell for joining us for the entire show this time out. The show is executive produced by Shannon Mueller, and be sure to like the What's Next with Peter Buffett Facebook page. We'll see you next time.